Last year, I made a little rundown of the games that were, in the opinion of Amiga Power, the very worst ones on Commodore's beloved computer. It was enjoyable for people to watch, even if it wasn't necessarily enjoyable for me to play them. Still, this is something that we can do for other magazines, within reason, and with Amiga Power done, it makes sense to look at that magazine's bigger brother, that being Amiga Format. Format was the biggest overall magazine going for the old Miggy. It originally started in 1988 as ST Amiga Format, before Future Publishing broke both those magazines apart in July of '89. And from there, Amiga Format would last for a whole 136 issues, not ceasing publication until May of 2000. Its sister magazines, Amiga Shopper and Amiga Power, also spawned from Format in May of 1991, with Amiga Format being the stable's all-rounder, covering both games and the hardware-software markets, while the other mags dealt with both the gaming and the serious sides of the Amiga coin, and they all operated out of Future's offices in the picturesque southwestern city of Bath. While these workplaces probably weren't quite as beautiful as the surroundings, they certainly produced a lot of good copy. Happily, looking at all the best and worst rated games for a magazine is a cinch thanks to the Amiga Magazine Rack, which provides the vital stats at a glance for every major MIGI publication. Considering that Amiga Format lasted an awful lot longer than Amiga Power did, naturally they reviewed a lot more games in total. Happily, this means we largely have a different selection of games to look at. Only 10 of the 30 games I've picked out were on the corresponding Amiga Power list, and we can largely gloss over those aside from a few choice quotes. Still, I've had to be a bit more generous with the threshold. Amiga Power were pretty damn brutal with their scoring, happily giving out percentage scores in the single digits to games they hated, meaning I could stick to looking at the 38 titles that scored 10% or lower. Amiga Format weren't quite as unforgiving. There's only 4 10% or below scores in the history of the mag, which wouldn't make for much of a video. But they were largely firm enough to call a terrible game exactly what it was, and looking at the games that scored 20% or under gives us a fine list of 30 stinkers, some of which are certainly well known for their crap factor, while others have fallen under the radar a little. We've got regular old guff, CDTV nonsense, edutainment, pap, and yes, a little bit of skin, so I may need to break Fred Elliott out again if necessary. But enough about all of that, let's get right into the Amiga action. Maybe we can do that mag at some point. Our journey begins in 20% land, and we're in the world of football management. EuroLeague Manager is first up, one of, well, so frickin' many footy manny games on the Amiga. This one was published by Guildhall, and it was reviewed in April of 1997, making it quite a late one. Andy Smith criticised the huge amount of bugs, the frequent crashes to workbench, and he quite simply calls it pump, a euphemism for a fart that's appropriate for both the time and the game. Bugs aside, this is just a basic footy manny game of the likes that had already been seen endless times already. It even manages to make menus bloody infuriating, as even the squad selection was a challenge, and matches are a slow affair where you'll probably have seen every highlight for goals and misses after about 2 contests. It's not good at all, and you wonder why it even exists when there were games like Premier Manager Freeout and what have you. The simple answer being that, at this late stage of the game, one of the few ways to get any kind of money at all publishing on the Miggy was to make games involving football. That's it. Next up, oh boy. A game that makes mortals tremble, and it sure isn't Civ. Amiga Power didn't live to see the arrival of Can Fu, but AF certainly did. The Greed Developments platformer got 20% in December of '96, and Andy Smith had nothing good to say. In his eyes, there's no reason to get hold of this no matter how desperate you've been for a new CD32 game. This is a hateable title indeed, even beyond the infamous gymnastics you need to perform in order to start the game up and not run into an out-of-memory error. Once you're in, well, this is it. a game that's strikingly similar to the much feared Top Banana in its mixture of regular sprites and digitised images, seemingly chucked about with reckless abandon, and the whole thing controls horribly indeed. Oh, and there's more creepy sounds too. One of the worst Amiga games of them all, this one. Make no mistake, 20%, far too high. Now the last game in this section is more of an oddity, Squibbly Shibbly. This was reviewed in July of 1997 and it's by an outfit named Miracle FX. It only cost £7 and it was made using a program called Reality Software Construction Kit. Andy Smith lays into the title, saying that the £7 should instead be spent on better PD games or simply beer and comics. You may wonder why we're only seeing screenshots and the review here. Well, that's because the game never came out. How so? Well, because of this review. Games That Weren't has the story on this one, as is often the case. Squibbly Shibbly was made by a 14-year-old kid named Daniel Jobbins. When he read the review, he was understandably quite dismayed, and thus, the game was never released. The issue here perhaps is that the Miracle FX operation perhaps appeared more commercial than it really was, looking like a game studio rather than a single person. Andy Smith didn't set out to purposefully crush a 14-year-old's hopes and aspirations of getting into the industry, but he naturally assumed this was from some commercial outfit and reviewed it accordingly, whereas if Squibbly Shibbly had been presented as a public domain title, the review would have likely been more forgiving. Hopefully we can actually play the game for ourselves someday. Here in the 19% section, we have our first repeats from the AP video. Covergirl Poker got 19% in format compared to the 6 points it accrued in power, with the review stating that playing cribbage with your maiden aunt would be more fun than watching badly digitised photos of page 3 girls taking off their clothing. And then we have one of the most infamous failures of them all. Good old Rise of the Robots. Rise scored 14 more points here than the 5 it got from AP, but Stephen Bradley's review is still damning. He says you're much better off looking at the screenshots in magazines than spending over £40. Ugh, jeez. £43 this pile cost. I'm sure that still stins for some. The other two games here are actually a bit more worthwhile in their own way. Kinsoft's Locomotion was very much disliked by Hugh Llewellyn, who slapped 19% on it in January of '93. In true 90s style, there's a lot of references to train spotting, anoraks, binoculars and all that, and he simply thinks it's pathetic. However, other mags quite liked it. CU Amiga gave it 80, and Amiga Power? Stuart Campbell gave it 84%. This isn't exactly a train game as such, it's a puzzler based on controlling the signals through ever larger networks of railways, getting the trains from station to station without crashing, hitting a quota in the time limit, and trying to achieve some sort of zen state where everything's running smoothly. And honestly, it's very good. It certainly gets hellaciously tough in the later levels, and I can't say I agree at all with Amiga Format's review here. It is kind of slight on the graphic front, but sure makes you feel like the old Signal man. Pursuit to Earth, on the other hand, is kind of crap. This game got 19% all the way back in March of 1990, with Math Evans saying that you shouldn't stop your finger when it urges towards the off button, because it knows what it's doing. This is a take on one of my favourite arcade games, GWAS, albeit with a Gradius-style power-up system, and yeah, it's kind of a mess. The graphics and speed are slow, and it really slows down whenever there's more than a few enemies and shots on the screen. This almost becomes part of the fun. If you can get yourself sufficiently powered up, it's kind of amusing to slow things to a crawl as you fire walls of bullets at enemies with detritus flying everywhere, even onto the scores and power-ups. That said, obviously this isn't a good game by any stretch of the imagination. We've got 3 pretty big hitters to begin the 18% range, so let's quickly run through them. Akira is here. ISA's absolutely dreadful attempt at bringing the legendary anime to the big screen got the score in January of '95 from Stephen Bradley, who said that the shock of loading it up could kill the faint-hearted. The game ended up scoring 2 points lower in Amiga Power. Sticking with licensed nonsense, we've got Cliffhanger, one of the drabbest attempts at converting an action movie into a platformer that there's ever been. Stephen Bradley gives this 18% in June '94, quite simply calling it abominable. And that's a word that cannot be disagreed with here. AP actually gave this one a point higher, with 19. And then we're off to the squared circle for WWF European Rampage, a hilarious mess of a game where you pin the opponents while they're face down on the mat. Amusingly, Neil Jackson's January '93 review starts by saying that an Ocean insider told everyone that if they thought European Rampage was going to be anything like last year's crap, that being WrestleMania, then forget it. Said insider was quite clearly misinformed. AP agreed completely with AF on this one, also giving the game 18%. Going a bit more obscure, June '95 brings us Battle Trucks, a top-down racing game that appears to be 2 players only and was sold for a tenner. As the review says, it's basically a version of Micro Machines where the cars are too big, travel too quickly, and are too difficult to control. And yeah, it's not exactly easy on the eyes. One of the uglier top-down racers I've ever encountered, to be honest. Considering when this was released, I feel that a tenner's pretty bloody steep for something as basic as this. It looks like a PD game, but it doesn't actually appear to have been one. Utter rubbish. Soccer Superstars is the final 18% title. Just when I think I may have played all the awful football games out there, here comes another one. Stephen Bradley compares this game to things like match fixing when it comes to the damage it could do to football. And to be sure, nothing about Flare Software's title leaves a good impression of the beautiful game. It's a basic, sluggish and ugly arcade-style footy effort with almost no meat on the bone. It's easier to tackle your own player than it is the opposition, completely mindless, stupid goalkeepers, the lot. And Flare wanted 30 bloody notes for it in the May of 1995. Sensible World of Soccer was in the shops at this point, and then there's this crap. But then, what else do you expect from the guys behind Dangerous Streets? We only have one game that scored 17%, and it's another mystery. This is Fatal Strokes, or to give it its full title, Fatal Strokes: The Art of Adventure. The title is at least funny. It makes it sound like some sort of erotic thriller where the femme fatale gets revenge on people by screwing them to death. But this isn't anything of the sort. The strokes are of the paintbrush variety, and you play as an artist who's given some special paints that take him into another world. There's adventure, puzzles and sub-games, but it didn't appeal to reviewer Andy Lowe. He gave it 17% in March of '93 and said that it is state of the art, but it's a shame that the art is basket weaving. Burn. However, this review, and a couple of previews, are all we have. Fatal Strokes never actually got a full release, and it is missing in action. There is little to no information as to why the game got dropped. It certainly wasn't ICE Software's last title or anything like that. It just, vanished. Possibly after the weak previews and bad AF review. Maybe there's a review copy around somewhere, who knows. It seems like a curious affair that would be worth at least a little look. I mean, surely it's better than their take on Akira. We have 2 more repeats in the 16% pile, and hoo boy are they awful. International Rugby Challenge got 16% in AF47, and it's a brutal review. Stephen Bradley, who seemed to get all the crap games in AF Towers, says that the game doesn't even make it off the team's coach, let alone into the dressing room. Still, this was the game that scored 2% in Amiga Power, the worst review in the mag's whole history, with the single exception of Kickoff 96, and I think that AP score is close to the mark because it's such a shocker. Stephen Bradley also had the misfortune of taking on Last Action Hero in June of 1994. He liked the film, but he didn't care for this beat-em-up that has numerous characters skating around a la Michael Jackson's Moonwalker, seemingly performing some kind of bizarre ghetto Morris dance. Amiga Power were even less kind than usual, giving that game 3%. Now, back in the AP video, a lot of the really weak scores came from budget re-releases of games that may have done better at some point, but time had certainly not been kind to them. And we've got another example of that in the shape of Thai Boxing. Made by Anko, this originally came out for the Amiga in 1987, and this re-release from Prism Leisure was reviewed by AF in August of 91. It may only be $2.99, but that's no excuse. The game is quickly dismissed as rough and ultimately laughable. Now, I can't really tell you much about this, as every copy I tried was thoroughly broken, and I'm assuming that's a crack or config problem, but from what little I could play, it's certainly lacking by 87 standards compared to the likes of IK Plus on the C64, and it surely has no business being on any shelf whatsoever in 1991, not even for a couple of pounds. We start 15% land with another intriguing and very obscure game called Access Denied. This is a largely text-based adventure title in the cyberpunk mode, set in the future, where you take a mission to hack a person's account and deliver a logic bomb that will destroy an antivirus program they're creating. Andy Smith didn't rate it though. In July of 96, he bemoaned the £13 price for a pretty simple adventure that could be completed in minutes, and although he rated the writing, he said there were PD games that were more fun, will last longer, and are a whole load cheaper. Now, I largely have to agree with Andy in this one, in that the writing side of Access Denied is very good indeed. The premise and the text are very engaging. However, the actual adventure side is far too simple, only really consisting of the odd multiple choice here and there, or some basic detective stuff, and it is only about 15 minutes long. The sad thing is that in the review, Andy mentions that Solo, the game's creators, are planning Access Denied Mission 2, with the hope that it will be bigger, more in-depth, and generally more engaging. A CU Amiga preview also hopes for the same thing, but alas, this sequel never appeared. Access Denied is certainly better than the second game here. Oh boy, it's Hollywood Hustler. What a treat to see this game here. It claimed to be the world's first live-action poker game, and it was nothing more than bog-standard 5-card draw with a few digitised photos and a couple of speech samples. That'll be £24.95, please. In November 95, Stephen Bradley called it the ultimate scam, mutton dressed as lamb, a sow's ear to silk purse, and in short, a horse's arse. As the review says, there are many ways to get a fix of cards on the Amiga, many of them considerably cheaper than this pile. Hollywood Hustler, though, is best remembered as one of the games that was aggressively championed by the Maverick edition of the One magazine, or rather, the Zombie One, shuffling about the shelves begging for mercy. There were huge previews, screenshots randomly dotted throughout each issue, a greatly positive 4-page review, and to top it all off, the full game was given away on the Christmas issue of the One in 95, barely a couple of months after it was reviewed and scorched by mags as a full-price title. There are few better examples of latter-day Amiga desperation and scumminess than this very appropriately named game. We skip past 14% and go straight to 13%, where we've got one repeat. Protector, which you may remember as one of the stinkiest attempts at recreating Defender that's ever been committed to code. This August 91 re-release of an already 5-year-old digital dung heap gets a brief dismissal, accurately saying that the lack of pace, combined with the curious screen scroll, that's put pretty bloody mildly, makes accurate turning and blasting nigh on impossible. Amiga Power gave the same re-release a vicious 6%, courtesy of Stuart Campbell's Poison Pen. It is surprising, to be honest, that the generally obscure Protector is here as a repeat, and not the other 13% game, which is much more notorious. We're going to the world of CDTV, and worse still, we're going online. Online have two entries in this video, and the first is Psycho Killer, a game that AP didn't review, but AF certainly did in March of 1992. The short review sums up the gameplay well enough. It's little more than a matter of clicking left and right through endless still images, with the occasional need to react by pressing a button in order to not die and have to sit through the whole loading sequence again. It's such a barren title that it makes a digital pictures game look like Elite when it comes to depth, and the feel, if anything, is reminiscent of a really terrible student film project. The game has been the subject of much mirth over the years thanks to the internet, and you're much better off rewatching those videos without actually playing it yourself. Don't do that.
Walking back across an open field, I had nowhere to run when he found me. No, my name is carved in stone. The ground is my eternal home.
The 12% zone is next, and here's a game you probably wouldn't have expected to see. Championship Manager 2. I didn't even know until recently that CM2 made it to the Amiga at all, but here it is, and this review takes us to March of 1998. Andy Smith, still batting for Format as he's been since the beginning, is dismayed, mainly because of all the disc swapping and the time spent staring at blank screens, and this more than anything is enough to warrant the low score. And yeah, that is what you get with this version of the game, a lot of loading. CM2 was actually previewed for the Amiga as early as August of 1995, with the expectation that it would come out around the same time as the PC version, which arrived in September of that year. And of course, it didn't. Various other previews come and go, and eventually we arrive in late 1997. Eidos have finally released the Amiga version, and you wonder why they bothered. There are a few cutbacks in terms of less backgrounds, simplified transfer markets and what have you, which is kinda here nor there because the loading just kills it. It's not built for anything but a standard Amiga, and zero effort has been made to rewrite code accordingly, with the result being that 99% of the game is loading and disk swapping. Honestly, I'm amazed this actually made it out, and it's a sad sight. Maybe it was a psyop designed to kill off the remaining Amiga users' floppy drives, reducing them to burnt out wrecks and making them go and buy a goddamn PC already. Here then is our second online entry from CDTV land. However, it is not, as you may have expected, The Town with No Name. Instead, we have their take on that most famous of Sherlock Holmes stories, The Hound of the Baskervilles. AF reviewed it in March of 92, and again they sum it up perfectly. The idea is that the book is presented like a case file, and you have to piece all the events and clues together in order to come up with your own solution to the mystery. Now this may well work fine in book form, but it sure doesn't work in CD form. What we have is something even less engaging than Psycho Killer, a game that is nothing but very slowly and ponderously going through tons of photos and reams of text with some sparse and rather bored narration peppering the action. It really is a whole load of nothing, and it sure doesn't make you feel like a great detective, unless you think simply looking at a picture of a sleeping dog and dumbly intoning "The Hound of the Baskervilles" is some form of genius. Obviously you should go look at the Sherlock Holmes Consulting detective games instead if this sort of thing takes your fancy.
October's calendar, with all important dates having been ringed in red.
We have only one game in the 11% bracket. It's a CDTV game, and it's not by online. It's Barney Bear Goes to School. Damien Noonan didn't much care for this, saying that it's probably one of the worst programmes ever. And it is pretty garbage indeed. It's a very basic edutainment game where you click around a schoolroom and play some mini-games based around spelling, or maths, or colouring in. There's not much else here at all, no music or anything. It is clearly designed for a very young market, but I can't imagine this low-effort piece of code inspired the minds of any child who had the misfortune to play it. Nor is the bad review due to a bias against educational software. A couple of fun school titles are right next to this in the roundup, and they get much higher scores. As they should, because they're a hell of a lot better than this.
A S E.
Very good. Now you can spell. Spelling is fun.
We've reached the 10% mark. Whereas here is where the AP video got started, it's the business end for Amiga Format. We have two repeats here, and first up it's the legendarily wretched conversion of Battletoads from November 94. Bloody Stephen Bradley got this one again, and he says that if you receive Battletoads for your birthday, simply smile politely and decapitate the bearer. Amiga Power was only 1 point lower this time, with Rich Pelly giving Battletoads 9. And then we have poor old Flight Path 737, a game that once had something on the C64 back in 1984, but should never have been re-released on the Amiga in the summer of 91. It gets a 10% from AF with a short blurb saying that even if it's £3, that's pricey for a disc you're going to want to format. AP gave it 4 points less than that. There are two other games here, and well, I was wondering how long it would take to get to a rhythm game. And here we have one called Strip Pot, reviewed in, July of 1995. Stephen Bradley, who I'm beginning to feel rather sorry for, says that this sullen excuse for entertainment is tosh of the complete variety, and sums the game up perfectly with the first sentence. It's an adults-only fruit machine game. And yeah, that's right. A basic one-armed bandit where every now and then you go up the ladder and see the odd naughty pick. That's it really. You get different pictures by completing a ladder, and this goes on until you run out of credits. Or Kleenex if you get into it. This is kind of like Hollywood Hustler in that the window dressing hides a very standard game indeed, the sort that could be found in PD land for virtually no cash. But here, it's sold for £15. Oh, and there's also a CD32 version, which is entirely the same as the A1200 version except that 1, it comes on a CD, and 2, it's double the fucking price. 10% is very much justified, methinks. Our final unfortunate title here is a game called Subversion. This is apparently a re-release from October of 1995, and it's a submarine game. Steve McGill despised this, saying that it belongs on a 16K Spectrum and that he wouldn't even recommend it to Paul Gascoigne. Now, I can only surmise from this put-down, and the time of this review, that old Steve here is an ardent Celtic fan, Gazza having joined Rangers. Trying to deduce the football allegiances of old gaming journalists is certainly more fun than Subversion, at any rate. It's a single-screen title that somehow still manages to be confusing in its interface, where the loading of redundant speech samples makes the whole thing feel slower than it already is, and despite being so basic, the game crashes if you so much as look at it funny. With the Amiga scene gradually falling to its knees, you can see why something this shoddy, even if it's basically a PD title, was utterly ripped apart.
Your supply ship was sunk by gunfire.
It's single digits time, and first up is a repeat, the truly infamous Kickoff 96. This is, of course, the worst reviewed game in the history of Amiga Power. It got a single percentage point in the mag's last ever issue, and while it may not necessarily deserve that awful a score, as it's not exactly the worst sports game on the Amiga, believe me, it's still hideous indeed, and Amiga Format's 9% review delves a bit more into the many problems here, with Andy Smith bemoaning how, gradually, one of the Amiga's flagship sports series has been destroyed over the years. He's played around with better reader games. He'll never play it again, and he hopes that he's ever saved you from having to play it too. Sadly, he hasn't been able to do that in my case. Sorry, Andy. I don't even particularly like Kickoff on the whole, and this game still makes me wince at just how far the series fell. Our other 9% game is Classic Invaders, and it's exactly what you think it is. It's Space Invaders. Or rather, it's an entirely terrible version of Space Invaders. We're going all the way back to August of 1989, the very first issue of Amiga Format, where we find Andy Smith telling us that while bringing a classic like this to the Amiga is not a bad idea, producing a version like this and expecting people to buy it is shameful. And yeah, it's an awful take. The second worst thing about it is how slow the aliens move. Even when there's only one left, that lone alien is still moving at snail's pace. Forget about the frantic endgame where you're trying to time that last creature moving at maximum speed towards you. It doesn't exist. The review also mentions terrible sound and questionable collision detection, both of which I can second. But the worst thing about this? Well, that's the price. Supernova tried to sell this atrocious version of Space Invaders for nearly 15 quid. 15 notes for something that would have attracted nothing but scorn if sold for 2 bob on the ZX81 at the start of the decade. Hell, forget that. I've played a more engaging version of Space Invaders that was coded for the bloody MK14. 15 quid for this? 9% is much too high. And here we are, the finish. 2 games that scored 5% in Amiga Format, 4 whole points ahead of anything else in the history of the mag. And unfortunately, they are both repeats. They're the 2 terrible sports games from Challenge Software, Test Match Cricket and Treble Champions 2. You may remember these titles as being utterly low effort and largely text-based cricket and footy efforts with no graphics to speak of at all and a hilariously impenetrable interface. Steve McGill reviewed both of these in May of 1996. He says that Test Match Cricket isn't just an enemy of the Amiga market, it's a blood-sucking leech that should be burned off with a cigarette. And in the case of Treble Champions 2, he says that the existence of a sequel to the original Treble Champions makes you question the existence of God, and that if he lived up to his reputation as being almighty compassionate, he'd protect his Amiga flock from the blasphemies represented by the very existence of this game. Harsh words indeed. Similarly harsh to those doled out to the 2 games from Amiga Power, where Test Match Cricket got 4% and Treble Champions 2 also got 5%, meaning that we've got another instance where AP and AF scores matched up perfectly. Hooray! So there we go. That's Amiga Format's worst games, all in one spot. Seeing as we've covered both this mag and Amiga Power, let's boot up one of Power's most handy features, the Disseminator, and compare scores between the 2 magazines as I blather. You may be wondering about some of the titles that appeared in the AP list but didn't make it here. I certainly was, so I've pored over the Amiga magazine rack and, while largely games that reviewed badly in AP also didn't do well in AF, I've come up with a few notable comparisons. You may remember Ruffian, a perfectly okay platformer that got utterly scorched with a 10% score from AP. Amiga Format gave that 50%, which I definitely think is closer to a deserving mark. On the lower and certainly wilder end of things, we have Ed the Duck 2, AP's worst ever rating for a platformer, earning 3%. However, James Leach at Amiga Format quite liked the game, and actually gave it 80%. Far higher than any other mag. Leisure Suit Larry 3 also fared better by them, whereas the late, great Jonathan Nash smashed this re-release with 9%, AF handed 70 to it. Still, for the most part, AP and AF generally agree, even if AF usually scores games higher. A 30 to 40% score from them is probably around the equivalent of a 10 to 15 or maybe 15 to 20 from AP, with games like Total Carnage, G-Loke, 4th and Inches, Fantasy Manager, Dangerous Streets and Dennis still getting a definite hiding. You may also wonder how Top Banana, true horror of a game that it is, again managed to miss out on a list like this. And the simple answer is that Amiga Format didn't review it. There's a fair few titles here that were only reviewed in one of the magazines. And with that, we're just about finished here. I initially wasn't sure if doing another worst rated games from Amiga Mags video was worth it, as I was concerned that there'd be far too much overlap. But the pages of Amiga Format have proved very much worthy, as there are a lot of quite obscure titles from the long history of the magazine, with several games that none of the other publications even touched. So perhaps other magazines will also throw up some more long forgotten kernels of dung. That remains to be seen. But hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and until the next time, bye for now.